Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we journey into the frozen wasteland of Alaska, where remote houses stand miles from civilization, buried in snow and darkness. These are not ghost stories passed down through generations. These are real accounts from people who discovered that true isolation means no one can hear you scream, no one can reach you in time, and sometimes the things that find you in the wilderness should never have existed at all. 10 accounts of terror where the beautiful Alaskan landscape becomes a prison and survival becomes a question mark. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Alaskan wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. Liam had been into winter photography for nearly a decade. There was something about the way light played against snow, the way frost clung to abandoned structures, the way the world seemed to hold its breath in the depths of winter. He had documented countless locations across the northern United States, but Alaska remained his holy grail. The landscape there was different, harsher, more unforgiving, the kind of place where nature reminded you that human existence was temporary, fragile, and utterly insignificant. His friend Marcus had been inviting him to his family's remote cabin for years. The property sat deep in the interior of Alaska, about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by snowmobile during the winter months. The cabin itself had been built by Marcus's grandfather in the 1970s, a solid log structure designed to withstand the brutal Alaskan winters. It had no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. Heat came from a wood stove and a propane heater. Light came from lanterns and headlamps. It was the kind of place that attracted people who wanted to disconnect completely from the modern world. Liam finally accepted the invitation in February, during what locals called the deep cold. Temperatures regularly dropped to 30 below zero. The sun barely climbed above the horizon, offering only a few hours of weak, gray light before darkness reclaimed everything. It was perfect for the kind of photography Liam loved. He packed his equipment carefully, double-checking his batteries, knowing they would drain faster in the extreme cold. He brought 2 cameras, multiple lenses, a sturdy tripod, and enough memory cards to capture thousands of images. Marcus picked him up from the airport in Fairbanks. The drive to the trailhead took 3 hours, winding through forests of skeletal black spruce trees heavy with snow. They loaded their gear onto 2 snowmobiles and began the final leg of the journey. The machines roared through the wilderness, carving paths through fresh powder. The cold was immediate and total. Even through his insulated gear, Liam could feel it pressing against him, searching for any gap, any weakness in his defenses. His breath froze in the air, turning to ice crystals that clung to his beard and balaclava. The cabin appeared just as darkness began to settle. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides, and overlooking a frozen lake on the 4th. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but the structure looked dark and cold. Marcus frowned as they approached. His brother Tyler was supposed to have arrived 2 days earlier to prep the cabin, getting the fire going, and making sure everything was ready for their arrival. But there were no fresh snowmobile tracks, no signs of recent activity. They parked the machines and approached cautiously. The front door was locked, which was normal. Marcus retrieved the key from its hiding spot and pushed inside. The cabin was freezing, perhaps 10 degrees warmer than the outside air at best. Their breath hung in clouds. Marcus immediately moved to check the wood stove, while Liam surveyed the interior. The cabin was a single large room with a lofted sleeping area accessible by a wooden ladder. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, and a bathroom with a composting toilet took up another. Simple bunks lined 2 walls, each with thick sleeping bags and wool blankets. Marcus got the wood stove going, feeding it kindling and small logs until flames began to lick upward. The propane heater sat in the center of the room, a large cylindrical unit connected to a tank outside. He opened the valve and pressed the ignition button. Nothing happened. He tried again, adjusting the settings. On the third attempt, the heater roared to life with a satisfying whoosh. Heat began to radiate outward immediately. Tyler arrived an hour later, full of apologies. His snowmobile had broken down on his way to the cabin 2 days prior, and he had spent the entire time getting it repaired in town. He had tried calling Marcus, but of course, there was no service out here. The three men spent the evening cooking a simple meal on the propane stove, sharing stories, and planning their activities for the next few days. Liam would focus on photography during the brief daylight hours. Marcus and Tyler planned to do some ice fishing on the lake. They stayed up late, far later than they should have given the early start Liam wanted for sunrise photography. But the cabin was warm now, comfortable, and the isolation felt peaceful rather than threatening. Around midnight, they climbed into their bunks. Liam took one of the lower bunks while Marcus and Tyler claimed 2 of the upper loft spaces. The wood stove had burned down to coals, but the propane heater continued to hum, maintaining a livable temperature. They left it running. Out here, letting the cabin get too cold meant hours of work to warm it back up. Liam woke to screaming. His mind struggled to process what was happening. The cabin was filled with smoke, thick and acrid. The screaming continued, Marcus's voice high-pitched and panicked. Liam rolled out of his bunk and hit the floor, remembering that smoke rises and the air would be clearer near the ground. He could not see anything. The darkness was absolute, made worse by the smoke that burned his eyes and throat. He tried to call out, but immediately began coughing, his lungs rejecting the toxic air. The heat hit him next, intense blistering heat coming from somewhere to his left. Through the smoke, he could see orange light flickering and growing. Fire. The cabin was on fire. His survival instincts kicked in. He needed to get out. He crawled toward where he remembered the door being, his hand searching the floor. He found the wall and followed it, moving as fast as he could while staying low. The screaming continued, but now there were 2 voices. Marcus and Tyler, both shouting, both panicked. Liam's hand found the door frame. He reached up, grabbed the handle, and pulled. The door swung open and he tumbled outside into the snow. The cold air hit his superheated skin like a physical blow. He gasped, drawing in huge lungfuls of clean air, his body shaking with violent coughs. Behind him, Tyler burst through the door, also coughing and gasping. Marcus came next, his face covered in soot, his eyes wild, but there should have been 4 of them. Liam's mind struggled to understand. 3 had gone to sleep in the cabin, 3 had escaped, but he could still hear screaming from inside. A 4th voice, one that had not been there when they went to sleep. Marcus heard it too. He started to move back toward the cabin, but Tyler grabbed him, shouting something Liam could not make out over the roar of the flames. Because the cabin was fully engulfed now, the fire had spread with terrifying speed. Flames poured from the windows, licking up the log walls, consuming everything. The heat was intense even from 20 feet away. And still, the screaming continued from inside. Someone was trapped in there. Someone was burning alive. Marcus fought against his brother, trying to go back in, but Tyler held him firm. Liam found his feet and moved to help, grabbing Marcus from the other side. They dragged him away from the cabin, away from the heat and the screaming. Marcus was sobbing now, screaming back at the voice inside, wordless sounds of anguish and horror. And then the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound had been. The 3 men stood in the snow, wearing only their thermal underwear and socks, watching the cabin burn. There was nothing they could do. No water to fight the fire. No way to call for help. The nearest other human beings were 40 miles away, across frozen wilderness. The cabin burned for hours. The flames were visible for miles, a beacon of destruction in the darkness. As the initial shock wore off, the cold began to set in. They had escaped with their lives, but nothing else. No proper clothing, no supplies, no shelter. Tyler ran to the snowmobiles and retrieved emergency blankets from the storage compartments. They wrapped themselves and huddled together, shivering violently, watching their shelter become ash. When the sun finally rose, offering its weak gray light, they could see the full extent of the destruction. The cabin was gone. Only the stone foundation remained, along with twisted metal and charred logs. The propane heater sat in the middle of the ruins, melted and deformed. And there, near where the ladder to the loft had been, they found the remains. A body, burned beyond recognition, curled into the fetal position that fire victims often assume. But it was impossible. 3 men had been in the cabin. 3 men had escaped. There should not have been a 4th. Marcus approached slowly, his face pale. He stared at the remains for a long moment before turning away and vomiting. In the snow, they needed to leave, needed to get help. But the snowmobiles had been parked too close to the cabin. The heat had damaged both machines. Tyler spent an hour working on them, his fingers clumsy with cold, before getting one to start. They made the decision quickly. Tyler would ride to town and bring back help. Marcus and Liam would stay, guarding the scene, making sure no animals disturbed the remains. Tyler disappeared into the wilderness, the sound of his snowmobile fading gradually. Marcus and Liam kept a fire going using wood from the surrounding forest. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They both knew what they had seen, what they had heard. Someone had been in that cabin with them, someone who should not have been there. The rescue party arrived 6 hours later. State troopers, fire investigators, and emergency medical personnel. They brought proper cold weather gear for Marcus and Liam. They documented the scene. They removed the remains for identification, and then they began asking questions. The investigators focused on the propane heater. They found that the connection between the heater and the external tank had been compromised, not through normal wear or accident, but through deliberate tampering. Someone had loosened the fittings just enough that gas would leak slowly. Not enough to be immediately noticeable, but enough that, over hours, the cabin would fill with propane. All it would take was a single spark, a single ignition source, and the entire structure would become an inferno. They also found evidence of forced entry. The window on the backside of the cabin, the side facing the forest, showed tool marks. Someone had pried it open, climbed inside, tampered with the heater, and then left. They had done it before Tyler's snowmobile broke down. Before anyone arrived, they had set a trap and waited for it to spring. But the body, the 4th person, that was the part that made no sense. DNA analysis eventually provided an answer that created more questions than it solved. The remains belonged to a man named David Hutchins. He had been reported missing 3 months earlier after a hunting trip in the area. Searchers had found no trace of him. He had simply vanished into the Alaskan wilderness. The official theory was that David had been living rough, possibly in a state of hypothermia-induced dementia. He had broken into the cabin seeking shelter, tampering with the heater, accidentally in his confused state. When the fire started, he had been trapped in the loft, unable to escape. It was neat. It was logical. It closed the case. But Marcus and Liam never believed it. They both remembered the screaming. It had not sounded confused or delirious. It had sounded aware, terrified, like someone who knew exactly what was happening and could not stop it. And there were other details. The investigators found food wrappers in the ruins, fresh ones, protein bars, and energy gels dated from the previous week. David's body showed signs of recent eating. He had not been starving or desperate. He had been prepared. The cabin was never rebuilt. Marcus's family sold the property within a year. Liam never returned to Alaska for photography. Some locations were not worth the images they offered, and sometimes the question of what really happened was more terrifying than any answer could ever be. Noah had never been particularly interested in Alaskan vacations. He was a beach person, someone who preferred warmth and sunshine over snow and darkness. but his mother had always dreamed of experiencing a true winter in the far north. And for her 60th birthday, she had made it clear that this was what she wanted: a family trip to Alaska during the heart of winter. Noah's father had rented a historic cabin outside of Fairbanks, a property that dated back to the 1920s gold rush era. The listing had been full of charm, describing hand-hewn logs, original fixtures, and an authentic Alaskan experience. They arrived on a Friday evening in late January. The cold was unlike anything Noah had ever experienced. It was not just cold, it was aggressive, predatory, searching for any exposed skin to punish. The cabin sat at the end of a long driveway surrounded by dense forest on all sides. Snow had piled up against the walls, creating drifts that reached halfway up the first-floor windows. The owner had left the heat on, and smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth inside. The interior was exactly as advertised: rustic but comfortable. The main floor consisted of a large open living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with updated appliances that looked oddly modern against the aged wood, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, each small but cozy, with thick quilts on the beds and braided rugs on the floors. The walls were covered with old photographs, images of miners and trappers from a century ago, their faces hard and weathered, their eyes staring out at the camera with expressions that were difficult to read. They spent the first evening settling in. Noah's father got a fire going in the fireplace. His mother unpacked their groceries and started dinner. Noah's sister, Emma, explored the property, taking photos for her social media, exclaiming over how authentic everything looked. Noah found himself drawn to the photographs on the walls. There was something unsettling about them. The people in the images looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. They looked haunted. That first night, they stayed up late playing cards at the dining table, drinking hot chocolate, enjoying the novelty of being completely disconnected from the outside world. The cabin had no cell service and no internet. The only phone was a landline that worked intermittently. Around midnight, they finally headed upstairs to bed. Noah's parents took the master bedroom at the end of the hall. Emma took the room closest to the stairs. Noah claimed the middle room, which was the smallest but had a window overlooking the forest. He fell asleep easily, exhausted from travel. He had no idea how long he had been asleep when his mother's scream woke him. It was not a long scream, more of a sharp cry of alarm that was cut off quickly. Noah was out of bed immediately, his heart pounding. He stumbled into the hallway just as Emma emerged from her room, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Their father appeared in the doorway of the master bedroom, his hand on the light switch. Their mother stood in the middle of the bedroom, her hand pressed to her chest, breathing hard. She was staring at the doorway, at the spot where Noah's father now stood. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then their father moved to her, putting his hands on her shoulders, asking what was wrong. She shook her head, still staring at the doorway. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking. She said she had woken up and seen a man standing in the doorway. A tall figure, dark and solid, just standing there, watching them sleep. She'd been about to scream when the figure vanished, not walked away, vanished, like turning off a light. Their father suggested it had been a dream, a product of sleeping in an unfamiliar place. She insisted she had been awake. She knew what she had seen. Noah felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He thought about the photographs downstairs, about the men with haunted eyes. He suggested they all go back to bed, that things would look better in the morning, but he did not believe it. None of them did. They returned to their rooms, but Noah doubted any of them slept much after that. The next day, they tried to act normal. They drove into Fairbanks and spent the day sightseeing. They visited the University of Alaska Museum of the North, where they learned about the gold rush and the people who had flooded into Alaska seeking fortune. Most had found only hardship. Many had died, either from accidents, disease, or the brutal winters. Some had simply vanished into the wilderness, their fates never determined. Noah found himself thinking about the cabin, about who might have lived there, about what might have happened within those walls. They returned to the cabin as darkness fell. The sun had been up for less than 4 hours, and now the long night was beginning again. They made dinner together, a deliberate effort to maintain normalcy. But there was a tension in the air now, an awareness that they were being watched. Noah kept finding his eyes drawn to doorways and windows, expecting to see something that should not be there. They went to bed early, around 10. Noah lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house. Old structures make noise as they settle, as the wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. He told himself that was all he was hearing. The creaks and groans were natural, nothing more. He must have eventually fallen asleep because he woke to a sound that did not belong. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from downstairs. He checked his phone. It was 2:30 in the morning. He listened, his entire body tense. The footsteps moved across the main floor, the old boards squeaking under weight. Then they stopped. Silence. Noah waited, barely breathing. After several minutes, he convinced himself he had imagined it. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. The scream came from Emma's room. This time, it was not cut off quickly. It was sustained, full of terror. Noah was running before he was fully aware of moving. He burst into her room and found her sitting up in bed, her eyes fixed on the window. She was screaming at something outside. Noah looked but saw only darkness and his own reflection in the glass. Their parents arrived seconds later, their father carrying a heavy flashlight like a weapon. Emma was sobbing, gasping out words between cries. She had woken to tapping on her window, soft at first, then louder. When she looked, she'd seen a face pressed against the glass, a pale face with dark eyes, just staring at her, watching. Their father immediately went downstairs and outside, flashlight blazing, searching the area beneath Emma's window. The snow there was undisturbed. No footprints, no ladder marks, nothing to indicate anyone had been there. But Emma's window was on the second floor, at least 12 feet off the ground. For someone to look in, they would have needed to be standing on something, or they would have needed to be impossibly tall. Their father suggested it had been a reflection, a trick of the light, but Emma refused to stay in that room. She spent the rest of the night on the couch downstairs, wrapped in blankets, unwilling to be alone. The third night was when things escalated beyond anything they could rationalize. They had discussed leaving, cutting the vacation short, but Noah's mother had insisted they were letting fear get the better of them. They had paid for a week. They were staying. But she agreed that they would all sleep downstairs together, setting up a sort of camp in the living room, safety in numbers. They arranged their sleeping bags in a circle around the fireplace. Noah's father kept the fire going, feeding it logs throughout the evening. They left lights on throughout the house, in every room, driving back the darkness. Around 11, they tried to sleep. Noah lay in his sleeping bag, watching the firelight dance across the ceiling, listening to his family's breathing as they drifted off. He was the only one still awake when he saw it. A figure sitting at the dining table. He could see it from his position on the floor, a clear line of sight into the dining area. The figure sat with its back to him, perfectly still. It was solid and dark, clearly the shape of a man, but somehow wrong. The proportions were off in a way Noah's brain struggled to process. Too tall, too thin, the shoulders too wide. Noah wanted to wake his father, but he found he could not move, could not speak. He could only watch as the figure sat there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then, without any transition, without the sound of a chair scraping or footsteps, the figure was standing, still facing away. Noah's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the figure began to turn. Noah managed to close his eyes. He squeezed them shut with all his strength, his entire body rigid with terror. He heard his father sit up, heard the sharp intake of breath that meant He had seen it too. Then his father shouted, and the house exploded with light. His father had flipped every light switch he could reach. Noah opened his eyes. The dining area was empty. The figure was gone, but his father had seen it. They both had. There was no more pretending, no more rationalizing. Something was in this cabin with them. They woke Noah's mother and Emma and told them they were leaving, immediately. They packed with frantic speed, throwing clothes into bags without folding them, not caring what they left behind. They just needed to get out. As they carried their bags to the car, Noah glanced back at the cabin. In the upstairs window, Emma's window, he saw a white orb of light. It hovered there for a moment, perfectly spherical, glowing with its own luminescence. Then it moved, passing through the wall rather than the window, drifting out into the night air before vanishing. They drove back to Fairbanks and checked into a hotel. None of them wanted to discuss what had happened. It was too fresh, too raw. But the next day, as they prepared to fly home early, Noah's father made some calls. He spoke to the cabin's owner, explaining that they had experienced some unsettling events. The owner's response was telling. There was a long pause before he asked what they had seen. When Noah's father described the figure, the owner sighed heavily. The cabin had a history. Multiple tenants had reported similar experiences over the years. The owner had tried to have it blessed, cleansed, investigated by paranormal researchers. Nothing helped. The phenomena continued, regardless of what was done. Previous tenants had described a man sitting at the dining table who vanished when approached. They had reported faces in windows on the second floor. They had heard footsteps when the house was empty. The owner's research into the property's history had uncovered dark facts. During the gold rush, the cabin had served as a temporary shelter for miners passing through the area. One particularly harsh winter in 1927, 7 men had taken shelter there when a blizzard trapped them for 3 weeks. When the weather cleared and help arrived, they found all 7 dead. Not from exposure or starvation, but from violence. They had turned on each other in the cramped isolation, driven mad by confinement and darkness. The scene inside the cabin had been described in historical records as unspeakable. The owner offered a full refund and an apology. He admitted he should have disclosed the history, but he was trying to make a living, and most tenants experienced nothing unusual. Noah's father accepted the refund without argument. They flew home that afternoon, cutting their week-long vacation to 3 days. Noah still thinks about that cabin, about the figure at the table, about the face in the window, about the orb of light that passed through solid matter. He has tried to research the property, to find out if others have had similar experiences, but information is limited. The cabin still operates as a rental. Reviews mention its authentic charm and historic character. None mention the shadows that watch from doorways or the footsteps that echo through empty rooms. Some places remember what happened within their walls. Some places hold on to suffering and violence, replaying it for anyone unfortunate enough to witness. Noah learned that lesson in Alaska, and it is a lesson he will never forget. Ethan had known Adam since college. They had been roommates for 3 years, best friends for longer. Adam was the kind of person who made impulsive decisions and somehow always landed on his feet. He had moved to Alaska 5 years ago, chasing a job opportunity that had turned into a successful career in environmental consulting. Ethan had visited him twice before, both times during the summer, when Alaska was warm and the days stretched endlessly. This would be his first winter visit. Adam had recently started dating a woman named Sarah. Ethan had not met her yet, but from what Adam had described, she was outdoorsy, adventurous, and completely comfortable with Alaska's isolation. For Valentine's Day weekend, Adam had rented a remote cabin about 60 miles outside of Anchorage. He had invited Ethan to join them, promising incredible views, total privacy, and some of the best winter hiking in the state. Ethan had agreed, curious to meet Sarah and excited to see Alaska in winter. The cabin was accessible by a combination of paved road, gravel road, and finally a snow-packed track that required four-wheel drive. Adam picked Ethan up from the airport on Friday afternoon, and they drove north as the sun began its early descent. Sarah met them at the cabin, having arrived earlier to stock the kitchen and get the heat running. She was exactly as Adam had described: athletic, confident, with the kind of easy smile that made people instantly comfortable. The cabin itself was beautiful. Modern construction designed to look rustic, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks lost in low clouds. Forest pressed close on three sides. The interior was open concept, all warm wood and comfortable furniture. A loft bedroom overlooked the main living space. The kitchen was fully equipped. It was the kind of place that appeared in travel magazines. They spent Friday evening cooking together, drinking wine, talking. Sarah and Adam had that easy chemistry that new couples have, constantly touching, laughing at inside jokes. Ethan felt like the third wheel, but did not mind, and he was happy to see his friend happy. They stayed up late, sitting by the fireplace, watching snow begin to fall outside. By the time they went to bed, several inches had accumulated. Adam and Sarah took the loft. Ethan claimed the pull-out couch in the living room. Saturday was perfect. They woke to a world transformed by snow. Everything was white and pristine, the kind of beauty that made the cold seem worthwhile. They spent the day exploring the area on snowshoes, following trails that wound through the forest. Sarah proved to be an experienced guide, pointing out animal tracks, explaining the ecosystem, sharing stories about her own adventures in the Alaskan wilderness. They returned to the cabin exhausted and exhilarated, their faces red from the cold, their spirits high. That evening, they drank more than they should have. The wine flowed freely, then shifted to whiskey. The conversation became louder, more animated. At some point, Sarah and Adam began arguing. Ethan could not remember what started it. Something small and insignificant that alcohol magnified into something larger. The argument escalated. Voices rose. Sarah suddenly stood, grabbed her coat, and stormed out of the cabin. Adam started to follow but stumbled, clearly too drunk to be steady on his feet. Ethan suggested they give her space, let her cool down, that she would come back when she was ready. Adam wavered, then agreed. He poured himself another drink. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a while before Adam suddenly stood again and announced he was going after her. He needed to apologize. He needed to make things right. Ethan tried to stop him. Adam was in no condition to be wandering around in the dark in sub-zero temperatures, but Adam was insistent. He pulled on his coat and boots and stumbled out into the night. Ethan watched from the window as his friend's silhouette moved toward the tree line, following Sarah's footprints in the snow. Then the darkness swallowed him. Sarah returned 20 minutes later. She had walked to the car, sat in it with the heat running until she calmed down, then decided to come back and talk things through like an adult. She asked where Adam was. Ethan explained that he had gone looking for her. Sarah's face went pale. She had not gone into the woods. She had stayed on the driveway. Adam would not have found her tracks leading into the forest. They both went outside, calling Adam's name, shining flashlights into the trees. No response. They followed the tracks leading from the cabin into the forest, watching as Adam's footprints wandered in an increasingly erratic pattern. At one point, the tracks circled back on themselves. At another, they stopped completely for no apparent reason, then continued in a different direction. It looked like he had been lost, confused, wandering without purpose. The tracks eventually became impossible to follow. The forest grew too dense, the snow too deep. Ethan and Sarah returned to the cabin and called 911. The dispatcher told them search and rescue would mobilize at first light. Sending teams into unfamiliar wilderness and darkness was too dangerous. They would have to wait. Ethan and Sarah spent the worst night of their lives sitting in that beautiful cabin, staring out at the darkness, imagining what might be happening to Adam in the cold. Search and rescue arrived at dawn, a team of 6 experienced wilderness rescuers with dogs, GPS equipment, and survival gear. They began following Adam's tracks from where Ethan and Sarah had lost them. The dogs picked up the scent and led the team deeper into the forest, moving away from the cabin at a steady pace. Ethan and Sarah followed at a distance, not wanting to interfere but unable to stay behind. The search went on for hours, then a full day, then 2 days. The tracks became increasingly difficult to follow as fresh snow obscured them. The search radius expanded. More teams were brought in. A helicopter flew grid patterns overhead when weather permitted. Ethan called Adam's family, made the worst phone call of his life. Adam's parents flew to Alaska immediately. On the 3rd day, the dogs found him. He was 7 miles from the cabin, far beyond where anyone had expected. He was alive, barely. Hypothermic, dehydrated, covered in scratches and bruises, but alive. The medical helicopter transported him to Anchorage, where doctors worked to bring his core temperature back to normal. Ethan rode in the helicopter with him, watching his friend's pale, frostbitten face, thanking whatever higher power existed that he had survived. Adam woke up 2 days later. His parents were at his bedside. Ethan was there too. The doctor said he was lucky. Another few hours, and he would have been dead. They wanted to know what had happened, how he had ended up so far from the cabin, why he had not tried to find his way back. Adam's response made no sense. He said he had been trying to get back. He had been trying the entire time. Over the following days, as Adam recovered, the full story emerged. He remembered leaving the cabin and following Sarah's tracks, but after a few minutes, he realized the tracks were not leading to the car. They were leading into the forest, deep into the forest. He had followed them anyway, calling Sarah's name, convinced she had gotten turned around in the dark. Then he started seeing the lights, small points of white light moving between the trees. They appeared in his peripheral vision, vanishing when he looked directly at them. At first, he thought they were flashlights. Other searchers. Help. He called out to them, but they did not respond. They just kept moving, weaving between trees, always staying just out of reach. He followed the lights. He knew it was stupid even as he did it, but he could not stop himself. The lights seemed to be leading him somewhere, and he could hear whispering, soft voices coming from all directions, speaking words he could not quite make out. The voices sounded like Sarah, like Ethan, like his mother, like everyone he had ever known. They were calling him, urging him forward. At some point, he realized he was no longer alone. There were figures moving through the trees, pale figures, humanoid but wrong. They moved too smoothly, too quickly. Their proportions were not quite right. And when he caught glimpses of them in the darkness, he saw that they were naked despite the cold. Their skin was white, almost luminescent. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's eyes. He ran. Pure terror overrode everything else. He crashed through the forest, branches tearing at his face and hands, snow soaking through his inadequate clothing. He fell repeatedly, getting back up each time, driven by instinct alone. The figures followed. He could hear them moving through the undergrowth, keeping pace effortlessly. And the whispering continued, now sounding amused. Entertained by his fear, he had no idea how long he ran. Time lost meaning. At some point, exhaustion overcame fear. He collapsed in the snow and could not get up. His body simply would not respond anymore. He lay there, expecting the figures to descend on him, to do whatever they intended. But they just watched. He could feel their eyes on him, even though he could not see them anymore. He drifted in and out of consciousness after that. Sometimes he was aware of the cold, of his body shutting down, of knowing he was dying. Other times, he was somewhere else entirely. Warm places, safe places, memories of childhood. He heard his mother's voice singing lullabies, felt his father's hand on his shoulder. He saw Ethan laughing at some joke from their college days. When the search and rescue team found him, he thought they were more hallucinations. The dogs sniffing at him, the hands checking his vitals, the urgent voices radioing for medical evacuation. None of it seemed real. Only the cold was real. The cold and the whispering voices that seemed disappointed he was being taken away. The doctors attributed his experiences to hypothermia and dehydration. The brain does strange things when deprived of oxygen and heat. Hallucinations are common. The lights could have been snow blindness or phosphins caused by pressure on the optic nerve. The figures could have been his oxygen-starved brain trying to make sense of shadows and tree trunks. The voices could have been auditory hallucinations. Everything had a medical explanation, but the search and rescue team found things that did not fit the medical explanations. Adam's path through the forest had taken him over terrain that should have been impossible to cross in the dark. Steep ravines, frozen streams with thin ice, areas of dense undergrowth. Yet his tracks showed he had navigated all of it without injury beyond scratches, as if he had been guided or led. They also found the blood. Adam's clothing was covered in it, not his blood. Testing revealed it was blood, definitely mammalian, but the species could not be determined. It did not match any animal in their database. The quantity was significant, suggesting whatever it came from had been seriously injured or killed. But there was no body, no blood trail, just the stains on Adam's clothes. Adam himself had no memory of encountering any animal, no memory of blood. The last thing he clearly remembered was running from the pale figures. Everything after that was fragmentary and confused. The doctor suggested he might have stumbled upon a predator's kill site, falling into the remains in his delirious state. But that did not explain the blood type, or why predators would have left a fresh kill untouched. The cabin rental company offered condolences and a refund. Adam never went back. He and Sarah broke up within a month, the relationship unable to survive the trauma of that weekend. Adam left Alaska entirely, moving back to the lower 48 states. He found work in Seattle and tried to rebuild his life, but he still has nightmares. Dreams of pale figures with reflective eyes, dreams of whispering voices calling him back to the forest. Ethan visited him in Seattle a year later. Adam looked healthier, more like his old self, but something had changed. There was a haunted quality in his eyes that had not been there before. When Ethan asked if he ever thought about what really happened, Adam was silent for a long time. Then he said he tried not to. Thinking about it meant accepting possibilities he was not ready to accept. Meant acknowledging that the world contained things beyond human understanding. The official explanation remained hypothermia and hallucination. Case closed. But Ethan knew what he believed. He had seen his friend's face when he woke up in that hospital bed. Had seen the absolute terror in his eyes. Had heard the raw truth in his voice when he described the pale figures in the woods. Some experiences cannot be explained away. Some terrors are too real to be dismissed as delusion. Alaska is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. And in its remotest corners, in the spaces between human settlements, perhaps there are things that exist beyond our comprehension. Things that watch, things that wait, things that sometimes reach out and touch the world of humans, leaving scars that never fully heal. Mason had spent every summer of his childhood at his grandfather's property in rural Alaska. The old man owned 200 acres of pristine wilderness, about 90 miles north of Juneau. It was the kind of land that developers would kill for, but his grandfather had no intention of ever selling. The property had been in the family since the 1950s, purchased for almost nothing when Alaska was still a territory. His grandfather had built a modest cabin there, living off the land for months at a time, hunting, fishing, and trapping. Mason loved those summers. His grandfather taught him how to track animals, how to read weather patterns, or how to survive in the wilderness with minimal equipment. The old man was tough, a product of a harder era, but he was also patient with his grandson. He shared stories of the early days in Alaska, of the characters he had known, of the harsh winters, and the ways people had learned to endure them. Those summers shaped Mason into the man he became. Self-reliant, respectful of nature, comfortable in solitude. When Mason turned 16, his grandfather began taking him hunting. They would spend days tracking deer and elk through the dense forest, moving quietly through terrain most people would consider impassable. Mason learned quickly. He developed the patience hunting requires, the ability to remain still for hours, to read the subtle signs that indicated an animal's passage. His grandfather approved, rarely offering praise, but showing his satisfaction through trust, taking Mason deeper into the property, sharing locations he had never shown anyone else. It was during one of these hunts that they found the clearing. Mason was 22 at the time, home from college for the summer. They had been tracking a bull elk for most of the morning, following its trail into a part of the property Mason had never explored. The forest grew denser, the trees older and larger. The underbrush became thick and tangled. They were considering turning back when Mason's mother, who had joined them that day at her father's insistence, pushed through a wall of young spruce trees and stopped. Mason followed her through the gap and felt his breath catch. They had emerged into a clearing perhaps 50 feet across. But it was not a natural clearing. Someone had made this space deliberately. Trees had been cut down, their stumps forming a rough circle around the perimeter. In the center of the clearing stood a structure. Mason's first thought was that it was a shelter, but as he approached, he realized it was something else entirely. The structure was constructed from branches and logs, lashed together with what looked like leather cord or sinew. It was about 6 feet tall and roughly conical in shape, but it was not meant for shelter. It was an altar. Inside the framework, arranged with disturbing precision, were dozens of animal skulls. Deer, elk, bear, smaller animals Mason could not immediately identify. They had been cleaned, of flesh and bleached white by exposure. Some were arranged in patterns, others stacked in small pyramids. Around the altar, driven into the ground in a circle, were wooden stakes. Each stake had been carved with symbols Mason did not recognize. Not letters or words, but geometric patterns and shapes that seemed to have meaning even if he could not parse what that meaning was. Between the stakes, someone had placed candles. Not modern candles, but crude ones that looked handmade. The wax was yellowed and dirty. The smell hit Mason next, something metallic and organic. Blood and smoke. Old blood dried and absorbed into the earth, but present enough that his brain recognized it. His mother had gone pale. She was backing away from the clearing, her eyes wide. His grandfather stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Mason had seen his grandfather face charging bears without flinching. But now, the old man looked unsettled. They did not speak as they examined the clearing. Mason's training told him to document what they were seeing, to note details. Near the altar, he found more objects. A metal bowl containing what looked like ash, a knife with a bone handle, personal items that did not belong in the wilderness. A child's toy, a faded plastic doll with one arm missing. A wallet, empty of cards or money, but still leather and real. A necklace with a silver pendant. His mother found the photographs. They were pinned to trees around the clearing's edge, protected from weather by plastic sleeves. Pictures of houses, of cars and driveways, of families through windows, surveillance photos. Someone had been watching people, photographing them without their knowledge, and bringing the images here. Mason felt his stomach turn. This was not just some weird shrine. This was evidence of something deeply wrong. His grandfather finally spoke, his voice low and tight. They needed to report this to the authorities. They needed to leave and not touch anything else. They backed out of the clearing, retracing their steps carefully. Mason tried to memorize the location, noting landmarks, but the forest was disorienting. Everything looked the same. Dense trees, thick undergrowth, no clear trails. He was not entirely sure he could find the clearing again even if he tried. They returned to the cabin, and his grandfather called the state troopers. The response was not what Mason expected. The dispatcher took the information but did not sound particularly alarmed. When the trooper arrived 3 hours later, he seemed even less concerned. He was a local man, probably in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life in Alaska. He listened to their description of the clearing, took some notes, and then said something that made Mason's blood run cold. He told them not to worry about it. He said there were people in these woods who practiced their own kind of religion, people who kept to themselves and did not bother anyone. He said that as long as they stayed on their side of the property line and Mason's family stayed on theirs, there would be no problems. He said it with the kind of casual authority that suggested this was not the first time he had dealt with the situation. He knew about the clearing. He knew about the people who made it, and he was telling them to leave it alone. Mason's mother demanded more information. She wanted to know who these people were, why they were on private property, why the trooper was not treating this as trespassing at minimum, possibly evidence of something much worse. The trooper's response was maddeningly vague. He said the land boundaries in this area were complicated, that some of the old claims overlapped, that the people in question had been here longer than anyone could remember, that they would not bother Mason's family unless Mason's family bothered them. The implication was clear. Stay away. Pretend they had not seen anything. Forget the clearing existed. The trooper left without taking them back to document the site, without collecting evidence, without doing anything that resembled actual law enforcement. Mason's grandfather was furious but also resigned. He had lived in Alaska long enough to know that the rules were different out here, that some things were tolerated because confronting them would be worse. They did not hunt on that part of the property again. Mason's mother refused to visit at all after that summer. She had been deeply shaken by the experience, by the clearing itself, but also by the trooper's response. The casual way he had dismissed their concerns, the suggestion that they were the ones who needed to modify their behavior, not the people conducting rituals in the woods. She began pressuring her father to sell the property, to get away from whatever was out there. He refused. Mason returned to college and tried to put the experience out of his mind, but it stayed with him. He found himself researching occult practices, looking for information about the symbols they had seen. He never found exact matches, but he found things that were close. References to folk practices that predated Christianity, to beliefs that had been carried to Alaska by various immigrant groups and then evolved in isolation, to people who worshipped older things, darker things than the God most Americans claim to follow. Years passed. Mason graduated, started his career, got married. He still visited his grandfather, but they kept to the familiar areas of the property. The clearing became something they did not discuss. His grandfather aged, growing frailer but still refusing to leave the land he loved. When Mason was 31, his grandfather passed away. Heart failure sudden, but not unexpected given his age. Mason inherited the property. He told himself he would sell it immediately. He had no desire to spend time in those woods, not after what they had found. But sentiment won out. This was his grandfather's legacy, the place that had shaped both of them. He decided he would visit one more time, in the spring, to say goodbye properly, to spend a weekend at the cabin to honor his grandfather's memory, and then he would list the property with a realtor. He went alone. His wife had no interest in Alaska, especially not after Mason had told her about the clearing. The cabin looked exactly as his grandfather had left it. Dust had settled on surfaces, but otherwise it was unchanged. Mason spent the first day cleaning, organizing, deciding what to keep and what to leave for whoever bought the property. The second day, he went for a walk. He told himself he was not looking for the clearing. He was just hiking, exploring the property one last time, but his feet carried him in that direction. The landmarks were still there if he looked for them. The cluster of 3 birch trees growing from a single root system. The boulder, split down the middle by some ancient freeze-thaw cycle. The the dead spruce with its top snapped off, probably by lightning. He found the wall of young spruce trees and pushed through. The clearing was still there, but it had grown. The circle of stumps was wider now, extending at least 20 feet beyond its original boundary. More trees had been cut. The altar in the center was larger, more elaborate. The skulls had multiplied, now numbering in the hundreds. They covered the ground in concentric circles, arranged by size, by species, by some logic that Mason could not determine. The stakes were still there, but they were taller now, driven deeper into the earth. The symbols carved into them had been painted, vivid reds and blacks that stood out against the weathered wood. Fresh candles stood between them, some burned down to stubs, others new and unlit, and there were offerings. Food items sealed in jars, bottles of liquid that might have been alcohol or oil or something else, pieces of clothing neatly folded, more photographs, many more, creating a gallery of surveillance that covered several trees. Mason's heart pounded. This place had been used recently, very recently. Some of the candles showed wax strips that had not yet hardened completely. The food offerings looked fresh. Someone had been here within the last day or two. Someone who might still be nearby, watching. He turned to leave and saw the message. It had been carved into a large tree at the clearing's edge, fresh cuts in the bark, the wood beneath still pale and sticky with sap. The message was simple and direct. Stay away. 2 words, carved deep, impossible to miss. A warning or a threat. Mason did not wait to determine which. He walked quickly out of the clearing, resisting the urge to run. He did not look back. He did not document what he had seen. He just left. He packed his belongings and drove away that afternoon. He listed the property for sale the following week, pricing it below market value to ensure a quick sale. A developer bought it within a month, planning to subdivide and build vacation homes. Mason never told them about the clearing. He told himself it was not his responsibility, that whoever bought the lots could deal with what they found, that he had warned the trooper years ago and been told to leave it alone. But he thinks about it sometimes. Wonders if the developers' crews found the clearing when they started surveying. Wonders what they did if they did find it. Wonders if the people who used that space are still out there, still practicing whatever dark rituals they conduct under the cover of the Alaskan wilderness. And sometimes, late at night, he wonders what would have happened if he had not left when he did, if he had stayed and waited to see who came to tend the altar. He is glad he will never know the answer. Lucas had never been particularly close with his uncle, but when the old man asked him to house sit for 2 weeks in February, Lucas agreed. His uncle owned a remote cabin in the Alaskan interior, a place he used during hunting season but left vacant most of the winter. This year, however, a valuable collection of his late wife's belongings was being stored there temporarily while his main house in Anchorage underwent renovations. He needed someone to stay at the cabin, keep the pipes from freezing, and make sure the place was not broken into or damaged by the weather. Lucas was between jobs, recently laid off from a tech company in Seattle, and the timing worked perfectly. His uncle offered to pay him, plus cover all expenses. 2 weeks in the wilderness would give Lucas time to think, to figure out his next move, maybe work on the novel he had been pretending to write for the past 5 years. He saw it as an opportunity, a retreat, time away from distractions and noise. The cabin was larger than Lucas had expected. 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, a bathroom with a composting toilet, and a shower that ran off a propane water heater. Solar panels provided limited electricity, enough for lights and charging devices, though there was no internet and no cell service. His uncle had stocked the kitchen with canned goods, dried pasta, rice, and frozen meat. A wood stove and a backup propane heater kept the place warm. By Alaska standards, this was practically luxury. Lucas arrived on a Friday afternoon in mid-February. His uncle had driven him out, helped him unload his bags, given him a quick orientation on how everything worked, and then left. The drive back to Anchorage would take his uncle 3 hours. Lucas watched the truck disappear down the long driveway, the sound of the engine fading until there was only silence. Complete, absolute silence. No traffic, no neighbors, no ambient noise of civilization. Just the soft whisper of wind through frozen trees. The first few days were exactly what Lucas had hoped for. He settled into a routine. Wake up, make coffee, spend a few hours writing, break for lunch, go for a walk in the afternoon, exploring the surrounding forest, return before dark, make dinner, read by lantern light, sleep. The isolation was peaceful rather than oppressive. He felt his stress beginning to fade, his mind clearing. He even made progress on the novel, writing several thousand words that did not immediately seem terrible. The weather was brutally cold, but stable. Clear skies, no wind, temperatures hovering around 20 below zero. Lucas learned to respect the cold, to never go outside without proper gear, to understand that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. But as long as he was careful, the cold was manageable, almost refreshing. The air was so dry and clean it seemed to sharpen his thoughts. The knocking started on his fifth night. Lucas had gone to bed around 11, exhausted from a long walk that had taken him several miles from the cabin. He was in that state between waking and sleep when he heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the back door, not loud but clear and distinct. Knock, knock, knock. He sat up in bed, his heart suddenly pounding. The back door faced the forest, the side of the cabin without the driveway. There was no reason anyone would approach from that direction. He waited, listening. Silence. He told himself it had been a branch falling on the roof, or ice expanding, or any of a dozen natural explanations. Old houses made noise. Cabins in extreme cold made even more noise as materials contracted and expanded. He lay back down. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Same rhythm, same location. Definitely the back door. Lucas got out of bed and pulled on his thermal pants and a sweater. He grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and moved quietly through the cabin. The back door was in the kitchen, a solid wood door with a small window set high. Lucas approached carefully, his breath fogging in the air despite the heat from the wood stove. He reached the door and paused, listening. Nothing. He raised the flashlight and shined it through the small window. The beam illuminated swirling snow. A light wind had picked up, creating small eddies and patterns. Beyond the immediate circle of light, there was only darkness and the vague shapes of trees. Lucas saw nothing that could have made the sound. No animal, no person, no fallen branches on the back step. He stood there for several minutes, watching, waiting for movement. The forest remained still. He returned to bed, telling himself it had been his imagination, or perhaps an animal bumping against the door while investigating the structure. But sleep came slowly. He lay awake, hyper-aware of every sound the cabin made, the settling of logs, the pop and crackle of the wood stove, the soft whistle of wind finding gaps in the construction. At some point, exhaustion won and he drifted off. The next morning, he checked outside. The snow around the back door was undisturbed, except for his own footprints from the previous day. No animal tracks. No sign that anything had approached during the night. Lucas felt foolish for having been afraid. He spent the day writing, pushing the incident from his mind. That night, the knocking came again. Same time, around 2 in the morning. Same pattern, 3 deliberate knocks. Lucas was wide awake immediately. He grabbed his flashlight and moved to the back door, arriving within seconds of the sound. He looked through the window. Nothing. Just snow and darkness and silent trees. He opened the door, feeling the cold rush in, and stepped out onto the back step in his socks. Stupid, but he needed to see. His flashlight beam swept across the yard. Empty. He looked down at the snow immediately in front of the door, smooth and undisturbed. But standing there, outside in the freezing night, he heard something else. A sound like fingernails dragging across wood. Slow and deliberate, scraping. It seemed to come from his left, from the side of the cabin. Lucas turned his flashlight in that direction, but the beam did not reach far enough. The scraping continued for perhaps 10 seconds, then stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. Lucas backed into the cabin and locked the door. His hands were shaking, though whether from cold or fear he could not say. The rational part of his mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Animals investigating the cabin, drawn by the smell of food or simply curious about the structure. Wind moving something against the wall, his own mind playing tricks in the isolation. But the primal part of his brain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive, was screaming that something was wrong, that he was not alone, that something was outside, circling the cabin, testing the doors. He did not sleep the rest of that night. He sat in the living room with a fire poker in his lap, watching the windows, listening for any sound. Dawn came slowly, the sky brightening from black to gray. Lucas felt exhausted and ridiculous. In the daylight, his terror seemed absurd. He made coffee and forced himself to go outside and check the perimeter of the cabin. He found nothing, no tracks, no scratches on the walls, no evidence of any disturbance. The third night, he tried to stay awake. He made strong coffee and sat in the kitchen facing the back door, determined to see what was making the sound. He had his uncle's hunting rifle next to him, loaded, safety on. He had never fired a gun in his life, but his presence was comforting. He waited. 11 o'clock passed. Midnight. 1:30. At exactly 2 in the morning, the knocking came. But this time, it was different. Louder. More insistent. The door rattled in its frame with each impact. Knock, knock, knock. Lucas jumped to his feet, raising the rifle, pointing it at the door. His finger was not on the trigger. He was too scared to put his finger on the trigger. He shouted, his voice cracking, demanding to know who was there. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the scraping started, but not on the side of the cabin, on the door itself. Something was dragging claws down the surface of the door. Long, slow strokes that made Lucas's teeth ache. The sound was deliberate, communicative. Whatever was out there was responding to him, acknowledging his presence, letting him know it heard him. Lucas backed away from the door, the rifle still raised. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. Then it stopped. Lucas waited, his entire body rigid with tension. Nothing. He stood there until his arms ached from holding the rifle, until his legs trembled with fatigue. Finally, as the first hint of dawn touched the sky, he lowered the weapon and collapsed into a chair. That morning, he examined the back door in daylight. There were marks, deep gouges in the wood, running vertically down the door's surface. 4 parallel lines, each about an inch apart, like claw marks. But they were fresh, the wood beneath pale and splintered. These had not been there before. Lucas photographed them with his phone, even though there was no service to send the images to anyone. He needed documentation, proof that this was real. He tried calling his uncle from the cabin's landline, but there was no answer. He left a message, trying to keep his voice calm, explaining that something was wrong and he needed to leave. But he could not leave. His uncle had the truck. Lucas had no vehicle. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. Walking that distance in 20 below weather was suicidal. He was trapped. He spent the 4th day preparing. He barricaded the back door with furniture. He checked all the windows, making sure they were locked. He kept the rifle close. He considered staying awake all night again, but he knew exhaustion would make him vulnerable. Instead, he forced himself to sleep during the day, cat naps that left him feeling disoriented but less fatigued. That night, he waited. 2 o'clock came and went. Nothing. Lucas began to hope that whatever it was had moved on, lost interest. Then, at 2:15, the knocking came to the front door. The side facing the driveway. The side that should have been visible from the living room windows. Knock, knock, knock. Lucas ran to the window and looked out. Nothing. No one standing at the door. No tracks in the snow. But the knocking continued, steady and rhythmic. Impossible. He did not go to the door, did not shout, did not challenge whatever was out there. He simply stood at the window, watching, as the knocking went on for 5 full minutes. Then it stopped. The scraping began again, this time on multiple sides of the cabin simultaneously, as if multiple things were circling the structure, dragging claws across the walls. The sound surrounded him, coming from every direction. Lucas grabbed the rifle and went to the center of the cabin, where he could see all the doors. He stood there, turning slowly, trying to track the sounds. They seemed to be coordinating, moving in a pattern. When the scraping on the north wall stopped, it started on the south wall. When the west wall went silent, the east wall erupted with sound. It was deliberate. It was intelligent. Whatever was doing this was not acting on instinct. The activity continued until dawn. The moment the first light touched the horizon, everything stopped. Silence returned. Lucas approached the windows carefully and looked out. The forest was still, peaceful, beautiful in the morning light, as if nothing had happened. But Lucas knew better. The claw marks on the doors and walls were real. He had not imagined them. When his uncle finally returned 3 days later, arriving a day early because he had gotten Lucas's voicemail and heard the panic in his voice, Lucas was packed and ready to leave. He had not slept. In nearly 72 hours, he looked like hell and felt worse. His uncle examined the marks on the cabin, took his own photographs, and promised to report them to the wildlife authorities. Probably a bear, he said. Though he admitted the marks did not quite match bear claws, Lucas never went back. His uncle paid him for the full 2 weeks, even though he had only lasted 1. Later, his uncle told him that the knocking had stopped after Lucas left. The cabin remained undisturbed for the rest of the winter. Whatever had been testing the doors, circling in the darkness, seemed to have lost interest once the cabin was empty again. Or perhaps it had gotten what it wanted. It had driven the intruder away. It had reclaimed its territory. Lucas still lives in Seattle. He found a new job, abandoned the novel, returned to normal life. But he has never forgotten those nights. The sound of knocking at 2 in the morning, the scraping of claws on wood, the certain knowledge that something was outside, something that understood what he was and chose to terrorize him rather than simply attack. That calculated malevolence was worse than mindless aggression. It suggested intelligence, purpose, and that thought keeps him awake sometimes, even now, in his apartment surrounded by neighbors and city noise. Because if it was intelligent, if it was purposeful, then it might remember him. And someday it might decide to knock on his door again. Jack had been looking for a project, something to occupy his time after early retirement from the software industry. He was 43, financially comfortable, and desperately bored. His wife, Rebecca, shared his need for a new challenge. They had spent their careers in San Francisco, working long hours, living in expensive apartments, dreaming of the day they could escape to somewhere quieter. When that day finally came, they realized they had no idea what to do with themselves. The Alaska property appeared in their search results almost by accident. They had been looking at cabins in Montana, Wyoming, places that were remote but still accessible. The algorithm suggested they broaden their search, and there it was. A foreclosed property 40 miles outside of Fairbanks. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, sitting on 12 acres of forest. The price was absurdly low, $70,000 for a house that would have cost 10 times that much anywhere in the lower 48. The listing photos showed a well-maintained cabin with modern fixtures, large windows, a covered porch, a metal roof that looked new. The realtor's description mentioned some needed updates but assured potential buyers that the structure was sound. Jack and Rebecca looked at each other and saw the same excitement. This was their project. They would renovate the cabin, turn it into a dream home, live the simple life they had been craving. They flew to Alaska in April, during that brief window when the weather was tolerable and the roads were passable. The realtor met them at the property, a woman in her 50s who seemed eager to close the deal. She walked them through quickly, pointing out features while glossing over flaws. The cabin was bigger than it looked in photos, The rooms were spacious. The kitchen had granite counters and stainless appliances. The bathrooms had been recently remodeled. Everything seemed legitimate. Jack noticed that the realtor avoided answering certain questions directly. When he asked why the property had been foreclosed, she said something vague about the previous owner losing his job. When Rebecca asked about the history, how long the cabin had been there, the realtor claimed not to have that information. When Jack asked if there were any issues they should know about, any reason the price was so low, the realtor insisted it was simply a motivated seller situation. Bank wanted it off their books. Location was remote. Limited buyer interest. They should have pressed harder, should have demanded answers, but they were caught up in the excitement, in the vision of what the place could become. They made an offer. It was accepted within hours. 2 weeks later, they owned an Alaskan cabin. They spent the summer in San Francisco planning the renovation, ordering materials, arranging for a pod to be delivered to the property with their belongings. In September, they drove north, towing a trailer full of tools and supplies ready to begin their new life. The first week was blissful. They worked on small projects, painting walls, replacing fixtures, organizing spaces. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool but not yet cold. The forest around them exploded with fall colors. They felt like pioneers, like they were building something real with their own hands. At night, they sat on the porch with wine, watching the stars, talking about how lucky they were to have found this place. Rebecca discovered the crawlspace entrance on their 8th day there. It was in the master bedroom closet, a small hatch in the floor that she noticed when moving boxes. Jack had not seen it during their initial walkthrough. The realtor had never mentioned it. They assumed it was just access to the foundation, standard in houses built on uneven ground. But curiosity got the better of Rebecca. She wanted to see what was down there, check for moisture or pest issues. Jack got a flashlight and pried open the hatch. Stale air rushed up, carrying a smell that was not quite right. Musty and organic with an undertone of something chemical. The crawlspace was deeper than expected, at least 4 feet of clearance. Jack lowered himself down while Rebecca watched from above. His flashlight beam swept across bare earth and foundation posts. Then it found something that did not belong, a sleeping bag, neatly rolled and placed against the foundation wall. Next to it, a backpack. Jack's first thought was that a homeless person had been squatting in the crawlspace, but that did not make sense. The hatch had been covered by carpet, hidden inside a closet. No random squatter would have found it. Jack opened the backpack. Inside were personal items, toiletries, clean clothes, a water bottle, packaged food with dates showing they had been purchased within the last year, well after the foreclosure. Jack called Rebecca down. They examined the space together, moving deeper into the crawlspace. It extended under the entire house, a network of earth and support beams. 20 feet from the entrance, they found the living area. Someone had set up a makeshift camp, a camping mat, more sleeping bags, battery-powered lanterns, and stacks of notebooks. Dozens of them, spiral-bound, filled with handwriting. Rebecca opened one of the notebooks and felt her stomach drop. It was surveillance notes, dates, times, and detailed observations. September 12th, 2019. Family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children. Father leaves for work at 7:15 a.m. Mother takes children to school at 8 a.m. House empty until 3:30 p.m. The entries went on, page after page, documenting the daily routines of whoever had lived in the house. Not just their comings and goings, but intimate details. What they ate for dinner, what shows they watched, what they argued about. Jack grabbed another notebook, different dates, different family. This one started in 2017, couple, no children. Husband works from home. Wife travels frequently. Husband stays up late watching adult content on computer, argues with wife over phone, sleeps alone most nights. The detail was horrifying. This was not casual observation. This was obsessive, invasive documentation of people's private lives. They found photographs next, hundreds of them, stored in plastic bins, surveillance photos taken through windows, people eating dinner, watching television, working at computers. Some of the photos showed bedrooms, people sleeping, completely unaware they were being watched. Jack recognized some of the rooms. These photos had been taken in this house. From inside this house, someone had been living in the crawl space, watching the families above, documenting everything. Rebecca was shaking. She wanted to leave immediately, to get out of the crawl space, out of the house. But Jack insisted they keep searching. They needed to understand the full extent of what they had found. They needed evidence to take to the police. Moving deeper, they found modifications to the structure. Holes had been drilled through the floor above, tiny apertures no bigger than a pencil, positioned in every room. Someone could lie in the crawl space and look directly up into the house. Some of the holes had been drilled at angles positioned to view specific areas: beds, showers, toilets. Jack felt rage mixing with his horror. Someone had systematically violated multiple families, turning their home into a surveillance prison. He was about to suggest they get out and call the police when Rebecca grabbed his arm. She was staring at something on one of the support beams. Carved into the wood, deep gouges that had been made with considerable force, were words: "Mine, my house, my people," over and over, covering several beams, territorial claims, declarations of ownership. They found more evidence as they searched: food wrappers with recent dates, water bottles that were still cold to the touch. Whoever had been using this space had been here recently, very recently, perhaps within the last day or two. Jack and Rebecca scrambled out of the crawl space, nearly falling in their haste to get up through the hatch. They stood in the bedroom, both breathing hard, both trying to process what they had discovered. Jack called the police immediately. The state troopers arrived within an hour, two officers who listened to their story with expressions that shifted from skepticism to concern. They went down into the crawl space and spent a long time examining everything. When they emerged, they called for additional units: crime scene investigators, evidence technicians. What had started as a property violation report had escalated into something much larger. The investigation uncovered the full horror. The notebooks documented 3 separate families who had lived in the house between 2016 and the foreclosure in 2023. Each family had been observed continuously, their entire lives cataloged without their knowledge. The photos showed increasing intimacy, with the photographer getting bolder over time. Some images showed items arranged around sleeping people, objects from the house placed in patterns around beds while the occupants slept. Proof that the stalker had not just watched but had entered the living spaces. The holes in the floor had been drilled strategically. Investigators found that ductwork had been modified, allowing sound to travel clearly from the living spaces to the crawl space. Someone lying below could hear conversations with perfect clarity, could listen to arguments, phone calls, intimate moments. The psychological violation was total. The families had believed they had privacy in their home. They had been wrong. The modifications also revealed access points. A basement window had been enlarged and fitted with a custom frame that could be removed from outside without leaving obvious marks. The foundation had a gap near the rear of the house, partially hidden by skirting, wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Whoever had been living in the crawl space could come and go without entering through the main house. They had free access, independent of the occupants above. The investigators asked Jack and Rebecca if they had noticed anything unusual since moving in. Strange sounds, items moved, anything. Jack remembered something. A few nights earlier, he had woken to what sounded like breathing, soft and rhythmic, coming from somewhere below. He had assumed it was the heating system or pipes. Now he knew better. Someone had been under their bed while they slept, watching through one of the holes, listening. The breakthrough came when investigators ran fingerprints found on the notebooks and compared them to criminal databases. They got a match. The prints belonged to the son of the previous owner, a man named Carl Hutchins, who'd been reported missing in 2015. The previous owner, Carl's father, had died in the house in 2023, which triggered the foreclosure. But Carl had never been found. He had simply vanished, assumed to be dead or living homeless somewhere. But he had not vanished. He had been in the crawl space the entire time, living under his father's house, and then under the houses of the families who bought it after his father's death. 8 years of hiding in the dark, watching strangers live in what he considered his home. The psychological assessment would later suggest severe mental illness, possibly triggered by his mother's death when he was a teenager. He had developed an obsessive attachment to the house, viewing it as a living entity he needed to protect and inhabit. The question became, where was Carl now? If he had been using the crawl space recently, where had he gone when Jack and Rebecca moved in? The answer came from an unexpected source. A hunter contacted police 3 days after the search of the cabin began. He had been tracking deer in the forest about 2 miles from Jack and Rebecca's property when he found a camp, a tarp shelter, supplies, and a man who matched Carl's description. The man had run when approached, disappearing into dense forest. A search party was organized. Dogs tracked Carl's scent through miles of wilderness. They found him hiding in a cave system that honeycombed the area. He was incoherent, malnourished, and suffering from exposure. When they arrested him, he kept repeating that he needed to go home, that his house was being invaded, that he had to protect his house. He seemed genuinely unable to understand that the house belonged to someone else, that his behavior was criminal. Jack and Rebecca never spent another night in the cabin. They could not. Knowing what had happened beneath their feet, knowing they had been watched, knowing Carl had been there with them made the place unbearable. They tried to sell immediately but found no buyers. The property's history had become public. No one wanted to live in the Stalker house. They ended up signing the deed over to the bank, walking away from their investment entirely. It was a financial loss, but Jack and Rebecca considered it a bargain compared to the psychological cost of staying. They returned to San Francisco, moving into a high-rise apartment with security guards and cameras and other people constantly around. They no longer craved isolation. They had learned that privacy is an illusion, that walls do not always protect, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who hide in plain sight, watching and waiting in the darkness beneath our feet. The cabin still stands. The bank has been unable to sell it. The listing has been removed from most real estate websites. Local knowledge of what happened there has effectively blacklisted the property. It sits empty now, slowly deteriorating, the crawl space sealed but still accessible to anyone determined enough. And sometimes, people report seeing lights in the windows at night, or smoke from the chimney, or footprints in the snow around the foundation. Whether these reports are real or imagined, no one can say. But the forest around that cabin has a reputation now, a warning that gets passed around in whispers. Stay away from the Hutchins place. Some houses are not meant to be lived in. Some spaces are claimed by things that will not relinquish their territory, no matter how many legal documents say otherwise. Henry had not wanted to come to Alaska for Thanksgiving. His sister had invited him, insisting that he needed to get away from Boston, away from the memories of their father who had passed away 6 months earlier. She lived in Fairbanks with her husband and 2 young children, and she thought time with family would help Henry process his grief. He had resisted, but eventually agreed, more to stop her worried phone calls than from any real desire to travel. The plan had been to stay at his sister's house in town, but a last-minute work emergency sent her husband to the North Slope for 2 weeks. She did not want to leave Henry alone in their home while she took the kids to visit her in-laws in Seattle. Instead, she offered him use of the family hunting cabin. It was stocked with food, had heat and electricity from a generator, and would give him the solitude he seemed to prefer these days. Henry accepted, seeing it as a way to avoid the cheerful chaos of his sister's family, while still technically participating in the holiday. The cabin was 80 miles north of Fairbanks, accessible by a rough logging road that was barely maintained in winter. His sister's husband had left detailed directions and the key. Henry made the drive on the day before Thanksgiving, arriving in late afternoon as the brief November daylight was already fading. The cabin was smaller than he expected, a single room with a sleeping loft, a wood stove for heat, and a generator that powered a few lights and a small refrigerator. Basic, but adequate for a few days of isolation. He spent the evening getting settled, starting a fire in the stove, testing the generator, organizing the supplies his sister had sent. The weather report called for a major storm system to move through overnight, but Henry was not concerned. The cabin was solid, the woodpile was substantial, and he had enough food for a week if necessary. He ate a simple dinner, read for a while by lantern light, and climbed into the loft to sleep. The storm arrived around midnight. Henry woke to wind hammering against the cabin, strong enough to make the structure groan. Snow pelted the windows in waves, creating a white noise that was almost soothing. He lay in the darkness, listening to nature's violence, feeling oddly peaceful. This was the kind of storm his father had loved, the kind that reminded humans how small they were, how little control they had over the world. Then he heard his name, soft at first, barely audible over the wind. Henry. A man's voice calling from outside. Henry sat up, his heart suddenly pounding. The voice came again. Henry, please. It was his father's voice, the exact timbre and cadence, the slight Boston accent that had never faded despite 40 years in other places. Henry felt ice settle in his stomach. His father was dead. He had been at the funeral, had helped carry the casket. This was not possible. Henry, I need your help. The voice was louder now, more insistent. It seemed to come from just outside the cabin, barely muffled by the walls. Henry climbed down from the loft, moving slowly, trying to convince himself he was still asleep, that this was a dream. He approached the window and looked out. The storm had intensified. Snow fell so thick he could barely see 3 feet beyond the glass. Wind created shapes in the swirling white, forms that appeared and vanished in seconds. Son, please open the door. The voice was at the front door now. Henry could hear it clearly despite the storm. It sounded exactly like his father. Not similar, not close. Exactly right. Henry's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that he was hallucinating from grief, or carbon monoxide, or simple exhaustion. But the voice continued, patient and familiar. I am cold, Henry. I need you to let me in. Henry found himself moving toward the door. His hand reached for the deadbolt. Then he stopped. Something was wrong, not with the voice itself, but with what it was saying. His father had been tough, stoic, the kind of man who never admitted weakness or asked for help. Even dying of cancer, he had refused to show pain, had insisted he was fine until the very end. He would never beg, would never ask to be let in from the cold. That was not who he had been. Henry stepped back from the door. The voice changed immediately. Henry, do not be foolish. Open the door. More commanding now. More like his father in that way, but still wrong. His father had called him by his full name only when he was angry. In normal conversation, he had used a nickname, H, short and simple. This voice had not used that nickname once. I can see you through the window, Henry. I know you're there. Henry spun toward the windows. Nothing visible through the storm. But now the voice was at the window, as if the speaker had moved across the cabin's exterior without making a sound. Let me in, and we can talk. We have so much to discuss. About what happened. About what you did. Henry felt anger mixing with his fear. What he did. He had done nothing wrong. He had been a good son. Had visited his father in hospice every day. Had held his hand when he died, had organized the funeral, had settled the estate. The voice was trying to manipulate him, to create guilt where none should exist. The voice seemed to sense his resistance. It shifted tactics. Remember when we went fishing in Maine? When you were 8? We caught that enormous bass. You were so proud. Henry did remember. It was one of his best memories of his father. One of the few times the old man had seemed genuinely happy. But that made this worse. Something was using his memories, his relationship with his father, as a weapon. "I miss those days, Henry. I miss you. Do you miss me?" The voice was softer now, tinged with sadness. Henry felt tears on his face. He did miss his father, desperately. The grief was a physical weight he carried every day, but he knew with absolute certainty that this was not his father. This was something else. Something that knew about his father, maybe had access to Henry's memories somehow, but was not the man he had loved. "Henry, I'm dying out here. The cold is killing me. Please. You can save me this time. You failed before, but you can make it right." Henry's hands clenched into fists. The manipulation was blatant now. He had not failed his father. Death from cancer was not something he could have prevented. The voice was lying, trying to exploit his grief, his guilt, his desperate wish that things had been different. "Open the door, Henry. Open it now." The voice was angry, all pretense of warmth gone. "I am your father, and I am ordering you to open this door." Henry backed away, moving to the center of the cabin, as far from the doors and windows as he could get. The voice followed his movement, seeming to circle the structure. Now at the back window, now at the side wall, now overhead, as if the speaker was on the roof. The storm intensified. Wind screamed around the cabin, finding gaps in the construction, creating whistling sounds that almost resembled words. Henry threw more wood into the stove, needing light, needing heat, needing something real and physical to anchor himself. The voice continued its assault. Sometimes it was his father, begging and demanding. Sometimes it shifted to other voices. His mother, dead for 15 years. His ex-wife, his childhood best friend, who had died in a car accident at 19. All of them calling to him, asking him to open the door, promising reunion and comfort if he would just let them in. Henry covered his ears, but could still hear them. The voices came from inside his head now, not from outside. Or perhaps they had always been inside his head, and the cabin walls had never been a barrier at all. He sank to the floor, pressing his palms against his temples, trying to block out the sound. The voices became a chorus, overlapping, harmonizing, creating a wall of sound that was inhuman despite using familiar tones. Then, abruptly, they stopped. Complete silence except for the storm. Henry waited, breathing hard, expecting the assault to resume. Instead, he heard footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate steps moving from one end of the cabin to the other. Something was up there, pacing back and forth. The ceiling creaked under its weight. Dust drifted down from between the boards. Henry grabbed the rifle his brother-in-law kept in the cabin. He did not know if bullets would stop whatever this was, but holding the weapon made him feel less helpless. He aimed at the ceiling, tracking the footsteps with the barrel. The steps stopped directly above him. Silence. Then scratching, like claws digging into the roof, trying to find purchase, trying to tear through. "Henry," the voice said, and now it came from everywhere at once. "You cannot hide from me. I know what you are. I know what you carry inside you. All that grief and anger and guilt. You think you loved your father, but you also hated him. You were glad when he died, glad to be free of the obligation. The relief you felt at the funeral, you remember that, do not you? How wrong it seemed to feel, light for the first time in years." The words hit Henry like physical blows because they were partially true. He had loved his father, but the relationship had been complicated. His father had been critical, distant, impossible to please. And yes, when death finally came, there had been relief mixed with the grief. Relief that the suffering was over. Relief that he no longer had to watch the man waste away. Relief that was immediately swallowed by guilt, but relief nonetheless. "I know all your secrets, Henry, all your shames, all the things you pretend do not exist. And I can give you what you want. I can give you forgiveness. I can give you peace. Just open the door. Let me in. We can make everything right." The voice was seductive now, promising exactly what Henry's wounded heart craved: absolution, release from the weight of complicated grief. Henry lowered the rifle. His hand moved toward the door again. Just a few steps. Just turn the lock. Just let in whatever was out there, and the pain would stop. The voice promised. It knew him. It understood him. Maybe it could help. Maybe this was the closure he needed. His hand touched the deadbolt. Cold metal under his fingers. One turn, and the door would open. One moment, and he could face whatever waited outside. He started to turn the lock. Then he stopped, because he realized something. The voice had made a mistake. It had mentioned the funeral, had talked about how Henry felt that day. But his father had been cremated. There had been no casket to carry. Henry's earlier memory had been wrong, a detail his grief-fogged mind had invented. But he remembered now. Cremation. Ashes scattered in the ocean. His father's request. Whatever was outside did not know that. It was reading Henry's emotions, his memories, maybe even his thoughts. But it was not perfect. It could make mistakes. And if it could be wrong about that, it could be wrong about everything. It was not his father. It had never been his father. It was something else, something that fed on grief and loneliness and fear, and Henry had almost invited it in. He wrenched his hand away from the lock and stumbled backward. The cabin erupted with sound, screaming from outside, inhuman shrieks that hurt his ears. The walls shook, the windows rattled, the footsteps on the roof became running, frantic movement back and forth. Henry collapsed against the far wall, holding the rifle, waiting for the structure to collapse or whatever was out there to break through. The assault continued for what felt like hours, but gradually, as dawn approached, the sounds diminished. The screaming faded to whispers, then to nothing. The footsteps slowed and stopped. The wind calmed. By the time the sun rose, weak and gray, through the dissipating storm, everything was silent. Henry did not leave the cabin that day. He stayed inside, watching the windows, listening for any sign the thing had returned. He did not eat, did not sleep, just waited. When his sister called on the satellite phone that evening, he told her he was fine, that the storm had been intense, but he had weathered it. He did not mention the voices, did not mention what had tried to get inside. She would think he was having a breakdown, and maybe he was. Maybe it had all been hallucination. But when he finally left 3 days later, when his sister's husband returned and drove him back to Fairbanks, Henry walked around the cabin first. The snow had covered most details, but he found them. Footprints circling the structure, far too large to be human. Scratches on the door, deep gouges in the wood, and on the roof, where something had paced through the night, he found evidence that made his breath catch. The metal roof was damaged, dented inward in several places, as if something massive had been pressing down, trying to force its way through. Henry flew back to Boston the next day. He has not returned to Alaska. He has not spoken to his sister about what happened, beyond saying the cabin was not right for him, that he needs to be around people. She assumes his grief is driving the decision and does not push. But Henry knows the truth. Something in that storm had come for him, had used his father's voice and his own guilt to try to gain entry. And it had almost succeeded. He will never know what it was or what would have happened if he had opened that door. And he is grateful for that ignorance. Some knowledge is too terrible to bear, and some questions are better left unanswered. Alexander had not visited the family cabin in 8 months. Life had been busy with work, with his new relationship, with all the obligations that filled his days in Anchorage. The cabin was a 3-hour drive followed by a 20-minute hike, remote enough that most family members only made the trip during summer. But Alexander felt guilty about the neglect. His grandfather had built the cabin with his own hands in the 1960s, and letting it sit abandoned felt disrespectful. He decided to make a quick trip in late March, during that transitional period when winter was loosening its grip, but had not yet released Alaska entirely. The roads were clear enough for his truck, and he wanted to check on the structure. make sure the roof had survived the winter, assess what repairs might be needed before summer. He told his girlfriend Emma where he was going and when he expected to return. She thought he was crazy for going alone, but Alexander had made the trip dozens of times. He knew the route, knew the cabin, and anticipated no problems. The hike from where he parked to the cabin was harder than he remembered. Snow still blanketed the trail, forcing him to break through drifts that came up to his knees in places. By the time he reached the clearing where the cabin sat, he was sweating despite the cold. He stopped at the tree line and looked at the structure. Something was wrong. Smoke rose from the chimney. Alexander's first thought was that another family member had come up without telling him. His cousin Michael sometimes made solo trips, but Michael's truck had not been at the parking area, and Michael would have mentioned it when they had talked 3 days earlier. Alexander approached cautiously, looking for signs of who might be inside. No vehicle tracks in the snow around the cabin. No snowmobile. Whoever was here had either walked in like Alexander or had been here for a very long time. The front door was unlocked. Alexander pushed it open slowly, calling out a greeting. No response. The interior was warm, the wood stove burning steadily, and everything looked normal, too normal. The cabin appeared exactly as it should, neat and organized, as if the family had just been there. The dishes were clean and stacked in the cupboard. The floors were swept. The furniture was arranged properly. Alexander walked through the space, his confusion growing. The refrigerator was running, powered by the generator, which should have been off. Inside the fridge, he found food. Not the canned goods and dry goods the family kept stocked, but fresh items. Milk, eggs, cheese, produce. Someone had been living here and had access to fresh groceries, which meant regular trips to town. How had they been making those trips without a vehicle? In the bathroom, he found toiletries, a toothbrush, toothpaste, shampoo. In the bedroom, the bed was made with fresh sheets. Alexander recognized those sheets. They were from his own apartment in Anchorage, a set he had been missing for months. He had assumed Emma had accidentally donated them, or they had been lost in a move. But here they were, on the bed in the family cabin, clearly being used by someone. The truly disturbing discoveries came when Alexander started looking more carefully. In the kitchen, he found that canned goods had been consumed and replaced with identical items. Someone had been eating the family's supplies and then restocking them, maintaining the illusion that nothing had been touched. The coffee can looked full, but when Alexander checked the brand, it was different from what the family bought. Same size can, similar label, but not quite right. He checked the closet where they kept spare clothes for emergencies. His jacket was there, the one he had left on his last visit, but it had been worn. He could see dirt on the cuffs that had not been there before. It had been washed, but not quite clean enough. Someone had been wearing his clothes, sleeping in his bed, eating his food, living in the cabin as if they belonged there. Alexander found the journal in a drawer in the bedroom, a simple spiral notebook filled with handwritten entries. He opened it and felt his skin go cold. The entries were dated going back 7 months, starting just a few weeks after Alexander's last visit. The handwriting was neat, methodical, and the content was disturbing. The entries documented the cabin in obsessive detail, measurements of rooms, inventory of supplies, notes on the building's construction, but they also documented Alexander's family. October 15th. Alexander was here last weekend. He brought a woman. They slept in the master bedroom. He mentioned planning to propose at Christmas. How did the writer know that? Alexander had not told anyone about the proposal plan except Emma, and that conversation had happened inside the cabin, in the bedroom, in private. He flipped through more pages. November 3rd. The cousin visited. Michael. He drinks too much. Talked to himself about his divorce. Cried in the kitchen. December 18th. Alexander's parents came for the day. His mother commented that the cabin smells different. She is perceptive. I will need to be more careful with the wood I burn. The entries went on and on, documenting visits Alexander knew about, and some he did not. His family had been observed, their private moments recorded, their conversations somehow overheard. Then Alexander found the photographs. They were tucked into the back of the journal, Polaroids that made his stomach turn, pictures of him sleeping in the cabin bed, taken from the doorway, pictures of Emma sleeping beside him, her face peaceful and unaware, pictures of his parents eating lunch at the cabin table, pictures of Michael passed out drunk on the couch, all taken without permission, without knowledge, by someone who had been in the cabin with them. Alexander's hands shook as he continued reading. The entries became more personal, more possessive. January 10th. I wear Alexander's clothes now. They fit well enough. I sleep in his bed when he is not here. I think he would understand if he knew. We are similar, he and I. We both love this place. We both understand what it means to need solitude. February 22nd. I have been here for months now. This is my home. They are my family, even if they do not know it yet. March 3rd. Alexander has not visited in a long time. I hope he is well. I miss seeing him. The final entry was dated 2 days earlier, March 21st. The supplies are running low. I will need to make another trip to town soon. But I worry about leaving. What if someone comes while I'm gone? What if they discover me? I have been so careful to leave no trace. They think the cabin maintains itself. They have no idea I am here, watching, caring for this place, caring for them. Alexander backed away from the journal, his mind racing. Someone had been living in the cabin for 7 months, hiding when the family visited, watching them, photographing them, creating a detailed record of their lives. And that person could return at any moment, could be nearby right now, watching Alexander read their private thoughts. He moved to the window and looked out. The forest was still and quiet, no movement, no sign of anyone. But that meant nothing. Whoever this was had been hiding successfully for months. They knew the area, knew the cabin, knew Alexander's family better than they knew themselves. He needed to leave, needed to get to his truck and call the police. But then he heard it. Footsteps on the roof, slow and deliberate. Someone was up there, walking across the metal surface. Alexander froze, listening to the steps move from one end of the cabin to the other. They stopped directly above where he stood. Silence. Then a soft thump, as if someone had sat down. Whoever was up there was waiting, listening, knowing Alexander was inside. Alexander grabbed the journal and the photographs, evidence he would need. He moved toward the door as quietly as he could. The footsteps resumed immediately, tracking his movement across the roof. Whoever was up there could hear him, could follow his position through the ceiling. Alexander reached the door and pulled it open. He ran. The snow slowed him down, each step requiring effort as he broke through the crust. Behind him, he heard a crash as something hit the ground. He did not look back. He just ran, following his own trail back toward the parking area. His lungs burned with cold air. His legs ached, but he did not stop. He reached his truck and fumbled with the keys, his hands numb and clumsy. He got the door open, threw himself inside and locked it. Only then did he look back toward the trail. A figure stood at the tree line, too far away to make out details, but clearly human. Tall and thin, wearing dark clothing. Watching. Alexander started the engine and drove, tires spinning on ice before finding purchase. He called the police from the first place he got cell service. State troopers met him in town and listened to his story. They examined the journal and photographs. 2 officers drove to the cabin that evening with Alexander. They found it empty. The stove was cold. The food Alexander had seen was gone. The journal and photographs were the only proof anything had happened. But they found evidence that supported Alexander's account. In the attic, accessed through a hatch in the ceiling, they found a living space, blankets and supplies. More journals, these documenting years of observation. And they found personal items belonging to multiple members of Alexander's family. Items that had gone missing over the years, and been written off as lost. Clothing, jewelry, photographs, trophies taken and hoarded. The police never found the squatter. They identified him through fingerprints left on the journals. A man named Peter Strand, wanted for stalking and harassment in Washington state. He had disappeared 3 years earlier after violating a restraining order. He had apparently made his way to Alaska and had been living off the grid, finding isolated properties to inhabit. The cabin had been perfect. Remote, occasionally occupied, stocked with supplies. He had settled in and claimed it as his own. Alexander never returned to the cabin. His family sold the property within months, unable to feel safe there anymore. The new owners tore down the structure and built something new, something without the history of violation. But sometimes Alexander wonders if Peter is still out there, finding new places to hide, new families to watch. The thought keeps him awake at night, makes him check the locks on his doors obsessively, makes him wonder if privacy is ever truly possible, or if we are all being observed by eyes we never see. Daniel had been on dozens of hunting trips with his father. They had been doing this since Daniel was old enough to carry a rifle, spending weeks in the wilderness tracking game, living off the land, testing themselves against nature. His father was a traditionalist who believed that hunting was about more than killing animals. It was about understanding ecosystems, respecting the food chain, and proving that humans could still survive without the conveniences of modern life. This trip was deeper into the Alaskan wilderness than they had ever gone before. They had flown into a remote area via bush plane, been dropped off with 2 weeks of supplies, and were now 40 miles from the nearest human settlement. The plan was to track caribou, maybe get a moose if they were lucky, and camp in different locations as they followed the herds. The weather was cold but stable, and both men were experienced enough to handle whatever challenges arose. They had been out for 5 days when they set up camp near a frozen stream. The location was perfect, sheltered by a stand of spruce trees with access to water once they melted snow, and showing signs of recent animal activity. They pitched their tent, built a fire ring, and prepared for several nights in the spot. The hunting had been decent so far. They'd taken a caribou 2 days earlier and had processed the meat, packing it in game bags to keep it frozen. The first night was uneventful. They cooked dinner over the fire, shared stories, and turned in early. The cold was intense, dropping to 20 below, but their sleeping bags were rated for Arctic conditions. Daniel slept soundly, exhausted from the day's hike. He woke once during the night to add wood to the small stove they kept burning in the tent, then fell back asleep immediately. The second night they heard the wolves, howling in the distance at first, then closer. Daniel's father sat up, listening intently. He had encountered wolves before and knew their patterns. A healthy pack would avoid humans, but a hungry pack might investigate, especially if they smelled the caribou meat. He and Daniel moved the meat away from the camp, hanging it from a tree branch about 100 yards distant. Then they returned to the tent and waited. The howling continued, moving around their position. Daniel counted at least 5 distinct voices, maybe more. His father kept the rifle close but did not seem particularly worried. Wolves were a natural part of the environment. As long as they respected the animals and took proper precautions, there should be no conflict. They listened to the pack communicate, the howls rising and falling in eerie harmonies, until eventually the sounds faded and silence returned. Daniel was drifting back to sleep when his father grabbed his arm. Daniel came fully awake instantly, his senses alert. His father was staring at the tent wall, his body rigid. Daniel listened. Something was outside, not far from the tent. He could hear breathing, heavy and deliberate, then footsteps in the snow, but not 4-legged footsteps, 2 legs, something walking upright. Daniel's father signaled for silence and slowly reached for the rifle. They waited, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled the tent. Whatever was out there was taking its time, moving slowly, deliberately. It stopped near the tent entrance, Daniel could see a shadow through the fabric, backlit by starlight. A human shape, tall and broad-shouldered, standing perfectly still. His father whispered, voice barely audible, "Who is there?" No response. The shadow remained motionless for perhaps a minute, then moved away. The footsteps receded into the forest. Daniel and his father waited another hour before either of them spoke. They discussed what they had heard. It could have been another hunter, though they had seen no evidence of anyone else in the area. It could have been someone lost, disoriented, unable or unwilling to respond to a direct question. Or it could have been something else. They did not sleep the rest of that night. They kept the stove burning, kept the rifle loaded, and took turns watching the tent entrance. When dawn finally came, weak and gray, they went outside to investigate. The snow around their tent told a strange story. Footprints circled their camp in a perfect ring, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. But the prints were wrong. They were human in shape, showing 5 toes and a heel. But they were barefoot, no boots, no shoes, just bare skin pressed into snow that was cold enough to cause frostbite in seconds. Daniel knelt beside one of the prints, examining it closely. The impression was deep, suggesting significant weight. The toes were spread wide, as if the person had been balancing carefully. But there were no other marks, no signs of distress or pain that bare feet in sub-zero snow should cause. The prince just circled the camp calmly, methodically, and then headed off into the forest. His father wanted to follow them, to understand what they had encountered. Daniel was less enthusiastic, but he trusted his father's instincts. They packed light, taking only weapons and emergency supplies, and followed the tracks. The barefoot prints led deeper into the forest, moving in a straight line with no deviation. Whoever had made them had known exactly where they were going. After half a mile, they found where the prints intersected with wolf tracks. The wolves had been there recently, probably within the last few hours. The 2 sets of tracks converged, and then something strange happened. The wolves had not attacked or fled. They had simply walked alongside the barefoot prints for a distance, then veered off, as if they were escorting whatever had made the human tracks, or at least showing no aggression toward it. Daniel's father stopped and examined the tracks carefully. He looked troubled, which was unusual. He was not a man who frightened easily. He said something that made Daniel's blood run cold. The wolves knew. They smelled it, recognized it, and left it alone. Daniel asked what he meant. His father did not answer, just shook his head and said they should return to camp. They followed their own trail back, moving quickly now. Both men felt watched. Daniel kept turning, scanning the forest behind them, but saw nothing. Just trees and snow and the fading light of another brief Arctic day. They reached camp as darkness fell and immediately began preparing to leave. They would pack up, hike back to their pickup location, and call the bush pilot for early extraction. His father did not explain the decision, but Daniel did not argue. Something about the barefoot tracks had deeply unsettled the older man, and Daniel had learned to trust his father's instincts. As they broke down the tent, Daniel noticed something. The caribou meat they had hung in the tree was gone, not taken by animals. The bags were still there, still hanging, but they were empty. Something had untied them, removed the meat, and retied them exactly as they had been. The knots were perfect, identical to the ones Daniel's father had tied. No animal could do that. They worked faster, packing with an urgency that bordered on panic. As they loaded their backpacks, Daniel saw them, eyes reflecting their flashlight beams. Multiple sets scattered through the trees around their camp. Too high to be wolves unless the animals were standing on their hind legs. The eyes blinked, shifted, but did not approach. Daniel's father saw them too. He unslung his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The report echoed through the forest. The eyes disappeared immediately. They hiked through the night. It was dangerous, moving through unknown terrain in darkness, but staying seemed more dangerous. They used headlamps and GPS, following the route back toward their pickup point. The forest was silent except for their footsteps and breathing. No howling, no animal sounds, just oppressive, unnatural quiet. At some point during the hike, Daniel realized they were being followed. He would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shapes keeping pace with them just beyond the reach of their lights. His father saw them too. He kept the rifle ready but did not fire again. They just kept moving, pushing through exhaustion driven by a fear neither man would voice. Dawn found them miles from their camp, still hiking. The shapes had disappeared with the coming of light, or perhaps they had never been there at all. Daniel's father called the bush pilot on the satellite phone and requested immediate pickup. The pilot asked if there was an emergency. Daniel's father said yes, there was, but offered no details. The pilot said he could be there by noon. They waited at the pickup point, a frozen lake that served as a landing strip. They did not talk about what they had seen or experienced. They just waited, watching the forest, jumping at every sound. When the plane finally appeared, descending toward the ice, Daniel felt relief so intense it was almost painful. The pilot asked what had happened. Daniel's father said they had encountered something unusual and decided to cut the trip short. The pilot pressed for details. Had they been injured, attacked, threatened? Daniel's father hesitated, then said they had found evidence of habitation. The pilot's expression changed. He asked where. Daniel's father described the location. The pilot nodded slowly and said they had made the right decision to leave. On the flight back to Fairbanks, the pilot told them what he knew. That area had a reputation. Other hunters had reported strange encounters. Barefoot tracks in the snow, missing supplies, the feeling of being watched. And there were stories, old stories, about people who had gone into the deep wilderness and never come out, or had come out changed, no longer quite human. The native tribes had names for them, concepts that did not translate well into English. People who had been lost to the forest, who had adapted to survive, who had become something else. Daniel's father listened, but did not comment. Daniel could see that the pilot's words confirmed something his father had suspected, but hoped was not true. They landed in Fairbanks, paid the pilot, and went home. They never discussed the trip afterward. Daniel's father packed away his hunting gear and never went into the deep wilderness again. When Daniel asked why, his father said only that there were things in the remote places, things that had learned to exist beyond human society, and it was better to leave them alone. Daniel thinks about that trip sometimes, about the barefoot tracks in the snow, about the eyes watching from the darkness, about the wolves that had recognized something and chosen not to challenge it. And he wonders what would have happened if they had stayed, if they had tried to confront whatever was out there. He is glad he never found out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some questions are better left unasked. And some places are better left unexplored, left to the things that have claimed them, that understand them in ways humans never will. Jacob had always wanted to flip houses. He had spent years watching renovation shows, studying real estate markets, learning about construction and design. When he finally had enough capital saved, he started looking for his first project. Most properties in Anchorage were too expensive, the margins too thin for a first-time investor. But then he found the listing, a condemned cabin 40 miles outside the city, being sold as is by the state after a tax seizure. The price was incredibly low, almost suspiciously so. The property had belonged to a man named Vernon Cahill, who had died in the house 18 months earlier. Natural causes, according to the listing, heart attack. He had been found by a postal worker after neighbors reported not seeing him for weeks. The house had sat vacant since then, slowly deteriorating, until the state finally moved to auction it for unpaid taxes. No family had come forward to claim the property or Vernon's belongings. Jacob drove out to inspect the property on a cold Saturday in March. The cabin was larger than the photos suggested, a 2-story structure with a full basement. The exterior needed work. Paint was peeling, gutters were falling off, and several windows were cracked. But the bones were solid. The foundation looked good, the roof seemed intact, and the location was beautiful. Surrounded by forest, private, with mountain views, Jacob could see the potential. The interior was a time capsule. Vernon's belongings were still there, untouched since his death. Dishes in the sink, mail on the table, a half-finished cup of coffee on the counter, the contents long since evaporated. It was eerie, walking through a dead man's life, but Jacob tried to remain professional. He documented everything, took measurements, made notes about what repairs would be needed. The basement was accessible through a door off the kitchen. Jacob opened it and was hit with the smell. Musty and damp, with an underlying chemical odor he could not identify. He descended the wooden stairs carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The basement was unfinished, just concrete walls and a dirt floor in some sections. Storage boxes were stacked along one wall. An old workbench occupied another. A water heater and furnace stood in the far corner. Jacob was about to head back upstairs when he noticed something odd about one of the walls. The concrete looked newer in one section, a patch about 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall. The color was slightly different, the texture not quite matching. Jacob approached and examined it closely. Someone had built a false wall, recently too. The concrete was not more than a few years old. He found a sledgehammer in the garage and returned to the basement. Part of him knew he should leave this alone, should call the police and report the suspicious wall, but curiosity overwhelmed caution. He swung the sledgehammer. The concrete cracked. It was not as thick as he expected, maybe only a few inches. Several more swings created a hole large enough to see through. Jacob shined his flashlight into the darkness beyond. A room, hidden behind the false wall, completely sealed off from the rest of the basement. He widened the hole until he could step through. The hidden room was about 12 feet square. The walls were lined with corkboard, the kind used for soundproofing, and covering every inch of that corkboard were photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. All surveillance photos taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. People in their homes, children playing in yards, women getting into cars, men working in their garages. Jacob felt his stomach turn as he realized what he was seeing. Vernon had been a voyeur, possibly a stalker, documenting people's lives without their knowledge. But it got worse. One wall was dedicated to a single family, a woman, a man, and 2 children. The photos showed them over what appeared to be years, the children aging from toddlers to teenagers. Hundreds of images documenting every aspect of their lives. School events, family dinners, birthday parties, all photographed from a distance through windows across yards. The level of obsession was staggering. In the center of the room sat a desk. On it were monitors, currently dark, connected to hard drives. Jacob pressed the power button on one monitor. It flickered to life, showing a grid of camera feeds. 4 different views of a house. The same house from the photographs on the wall. The feeds were live. Jacob could see lights on inside. Movement in one of the windows. Someone was home. Vernon had been surveilling this family in real time, and the system was still running. Jacob's hands shook as he checked the other equipment. Multiple hard drives, labeled by year, going back a decade. File cabinets filled with printed photographs, organized by subject. Notebooks containing detailed logs of the family's activities. Times they left for work, times the children went to school. Patterns of behavior documented with obsessive precision. Then Jacob found the plans. Detailed blueprints of multiple houses, including the one being actively surveilled. The blueprints showed modifications. Hidden cameras installed in air vents, microphones placed in walls, access points circled and labeled. Jacob realized with horror that Vernon had not just been watching from a distance. He had been inside these homes. He had modified them, turning them into surveillance platforms without the occupants' knowledge. The worst discovery was in the bottom drawer of the file cabinet, a box containing personal items. Jewelry, children's toys. articles of clothing, all labeled with names and dates, trophies, things taken from the homes Vernon had been watching, kept as souvenirs. Some items were labeled with the same family name he had seen on the photographs, the Hendersons. Vernon had been obsessed with them for years. Jacob backed out of the room, his mind racing. He needed to call the police immediately, but as he turned to leave, he heard something. A sound from upstairs. Footsteps. Someone was in the house. Jacob froze, listening. The footsteps moved across the floor above him, slow and deliberate, heading toward the kitchen, toward the basement door. Jacob looked around for another exit. There was a window well on the far side of the basement, but it was small and high, covered with decades of grime. He would never get through it in time. The footsteps stopped at the top of the basement stairs. Jacob held his breath. Then he heard a voice, a man's voice, calling out, "Is someone down there? I saw your car." Jacob remained silent. The voice continued, "You should not be here. This is private property." Jacob's mind raced. He could identify himself, explain he was a potential buyer inspecting the property. But something about the voice stopped him. It was too calm, too controlled, as if the speaker already knew Jacob was there and was just going through the motions. The footsteps began descending the stairs. Jacob retreated into the hidden room, pulling himself through the hole in the concrete wall. He pressed against the side wall, out of direct line of sight. The footsteps reached the basement floor, stopped, then moved toward the false wall. The man had found the hole Jacob had made. Jacob heard breathing on the other side of the wall. Close, very close. Then the voice again, softer now. "You found Father's room. He would be very unhappy about that. Very unhappy." Jacob's blood went cold. Vernon's son, the man who had been missing for 3 years, according to the property records. The man whose name was on all the surveillance files, Carl Cahill. A flashlight beam swept through the hole, illuminating the hidden room. Jacob pressed himself flatter against the wall, praying the angle would hide him. The beam moved slowly, methodically checking every corner. Then it stopped, pointed directly at him. Carl spoke again. "Hello, Jacob. I've been watching you too." Jacob ran. He did not think, just moved. He lunged toward the hole in the wall, squeezing through, scraping his shoulders on the broken concrete. Carl tried to grab him, but Jacob twisted away. He ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind him, Carl was following, not running, but walking with that same deliberate pace. Jacob burst through the basement door, sprinted across the kitchen, and ran for the front door. It was locked. The deadbolt was engaged, but Jacob did not remember locking it when he entered. His hands fumbled with the lock, finally getting it open. He tore the door open and ran to his car. He could see Carl now, standing in the doorway of the cabin, watching him, making no attempt to chase, just watching with an expression that was almost amused. Jacob got his car started and drove, tires spinning on the dirt road before finding traction. He did not stop until he reached the main highway. Then he pulled over and called 911. He told the dispatcher everything: the hidden room, the surveillance equipment, the stolen items, and Carl, Vernon's son, who was supposed to be missing but was very much alive and living in his father's house. The police response was immediate. Multiple units headed to the property. Jacob met them at a gas station and led them back. When they arrived, the cabin was empty. Carl was gone, but everything else was there. The hidden room, the surveillance equipment, the photographs, the trophies, evidence of decades of stalking and invasion of privacy. The investigation that followed uncovered the full scope of the operation. Vernon and Carl had been working together for years, father and son united in their obsession. Vernon had been the planner, the organizer. Carl had been the one who entered the homes, installed the equipment, took the trophies. When Vernon died, Carl had continued the work alone. He had been living in the cabin, monitoring the families, adding to the collection. The surveillance equipment was still transmitting to the Henderson home. Police went there and found cameras hidden in vents, microphones, in wall outlets, exactly as the blueprints had shown. The family had been living under constant observation for over 8 years without knowing. 4 other families were identified from the files. All had been similarly compromised. All had their homes turned into surveillance platforms by Vernon and Carl's systematic invasions. Carl was never found. Police searched for months. They tracked his movements through wilderness areas, followed tips from people who thought they had seen him, but he had vanished into the Alaskan interior. Some investigators believe he is still out there, possibly continuing his father's work in new locations. Others think he died in the wilderness. But his fate remains unknown. Jacob never completed the purchase. He could not bring himself to return to that property, even with Carl gone. The cabin was eventually demolished by the state. The Henderson family moved to a different state, unable to feel safe in the home they had loved. The other families did the same, lives disrupted by the actions of 2 men who had turned voyeurism into a family business. Jacob still flips houses, but he is more cautious now. He always brings someone with him on inspections. He looks for signs of hidden rooms, unusual modifications, anything that suggests a property has secrets. And sometimes late at night, he thinks about Carl's voice in that basement. The calm certainty, the way he had said Jacob's name, as if they knew each other, as if Carl had been watching him long before Jacob ever found that cabin. The surveillance files contained information about Jacob too. Recent additions started the moment Jacob first viewed the online listing, his address, his routines, photos of him leaving his apartment, the realization that he had become one of Carl's subjects, that he had been observed, while he thought he was the one doing the investigating, haunts him still. Because if Carl is alive, if he is still out there, he might remember. He might still be watching. And that possibility turns every shadow into a threat, every unexpected sound into potential danger. Some people collect stamps or coins. Vernon and Carl collected lives, and their collection might not be finished